Hello and welcome to Fraud Talk, a monthly podcast of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. I'm John Duffley, the ACFE's Communications Director, and in this episode, I talk with Heather Vescent, a futurist, researcher, and CEO of the Purple Tornado, a futures research and media studio exploring how emerging technologies transform society, identity, and human relationships. For more than a decade, Heather has helped clients from Disney to the U.S. Department of Homeland Security make sense of complex futures, from digital identity and cybersecurity to money, intimacy, and the Internet of Things. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, American Banker, CNN, Fox, and many more. She's also produced 10 short films that visualize the future in the present tense. In this episode, we explore what it means to be a futurist, how the concept of strategic foresight can be applied through a fraud examination lens, the intersection of cybersecurity and fraud, including how artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies like decentralized identity are changing the landscape, and what lies ahead for anti-fraud professionals in 2026 and beyond. Okay, Heather, thanks for joining us. Another episode of Fraud Talk. We have a lot I want to get to today. I know in our prep calls, we've had a ton of interesting conversations about what you do, how it applies generally. Both will talk specifically today about the anti-fraud profession and what our audience can take away from some of your insight and your expertise. But I think the first question is pretty straightforward one. Can you define what a futurist is and explain a little bit about kind of what you do and what it means to be a futurist?
Yeah, John, of course. I'm so excited to be here. So I like to think of the future, a futurist is, I'm both an artist and a scientist. So most of us think that the future is like the past and the present. There's one past, there's one present, so we think there's one future. But really, the future hasn't happened yet. There's all kinds of possibilities and things that could happen. In fact, there's all kinds of things happening today in the present that change the trajectory of the future. And so what I do as a futurist is I'm paying attention to all the things that are happening today, forces of change, trends, small and big trends, and exploring how they might get extrapolated out into the future. So I do that with creating user scenarios. I do that creating scenarios about the future. And so if you think about what the future is it hasn't happened yet. Things could happen in all kinds of different ways. Like you could have like a variable, like say, for example, you could have some regulation that requires companies to have some type of insurance or something. Mm-hmm. And that would have the result of maybe reducing fraud or maybe increasing fraud. And so you've got two different types of futures, right? You could have the future where the regulation gets passed or the future where there is no regulation. And those two futures look really different. And so by looking at what is changing in the present moment and then extrapolating it out to the future, you can say, okay, what does it look like in, future possibility A, regulation, future possibility B, no regulation. That's just one example of a variable. As a futurist, I'm looking at all kinds of different variables. And I like to look and focus in cybersecurity futures. In particular, how technology is influencing humanity, both in positive and negative ways. I would say increasing our humanity, increasing vulnerabilities. And at the core of my motivation for my work being a futurist is that I believe that the future can be better than the present. But we have to know what that future might be in order to take better decisions today, right? If we know, okay, regulation will result in less fraud, then, hey, we can work to try to make that regulation happen. But if we're like, less regulation is like less fraud, then we can work to make that happen. But unless we understand the impact of our decisions today, we won't know which is the right decision to make. So that kind of explains what I try to do on both like a meta level and also work I try to do for clients. So
yeah, I mean, I could see the complexity of that, is that variable change modeling, taking a ton of different avenues. Like you said, it's can be large, small, the human aspect. We'll talk about technology a little bit today, how like those intertwine. So I know your background is, I think formally, if I'm not mistaken, in strategic foresight, and kind of, I think kind of goes into what you said about like trying to put together all the pieces to understand possible outcomes. So When you started down this career path, I'm curious, what did you realize early on about like what you're doing now that maybe you hadn't considered before in this, again, this kind of like large, I guess, unknown that is the future, obviously.
Yeah, well, I didn't set out to be a futurist. I started in the early part of my career. I worked in Silicon Valley for a lot of tech startups, and I found myself working for startups that were ahead of their time. I was just naturally, well, they were ahead of their time to be profit successful, financially successful. So I was like, I went to this conference. I talked to someone, and he said, he's like, "What do you do?" And I was like explaining what I was doing, and he's like, "Oh, you're a futurist." And I was like, "What's that?" And I was like, "Ooh, that feels like a little too woo woo or who knows what." Um, Long story short, I ended up going back to school, and I got my master's of science in strategic foresight at University of Houston. And going through that program was really like life changing. It changed the way I perceive and see things. I already have like a brain that likes to do pattern recognition and try to figure out how things fit together and then understand leverage points. So I'm already like naturally like attracted to that kind of stuff and have intuitive understanding of things. One of the things that was kind of the most surprising like learnings and unlearnings I had is I came from the tech industry. So I had this belief that technology is going to solve all the problems. That's kind of always what we had. But then I went through my programming. I realized that that is a bias. And so one of the things I had to learn is like my personal biases. That's just a really obvious example, right? If you come from tech is this be all end all solution to everything. But unfortunately, technology often will introduce problems with the solutions that they put forth.
Sure.
And so part of I kind of go back and forth working in tech and then working back and forth Foresight is for a while I was working within digital identity technology to try to reduce unintended consequences. This goes back to like what I first said it was about, right? So if you understand what's happening today and what the result of the actions you take today can have on tomorrow, then you can make better decisions. And so I was trying to bring that kind of sense of awareness to current technology decisions when we were trying to design about like standards with the specific result of reducing unintended consequences. And you can do that. It's just like building technology can be hard enough as it is. I mean, really doing anything is hard enough as it is. To try to put another layer on top of it, which is what I can offer, to put another layer on top of it to understand how that can impact something for the positive or the negative can be kind of overwhelming. And so really understanding one's biases, understanding how those might get hiddenly, influence your scenarios. That's probably like one of the biggest things, and requiring a level of rigor and ethical self-awareness doing this type of work, because I truly want the future to be better. And I don't want to inadvertently introduce something that might skew a future scenario in a negative way. I don't want to have an unintended consequence with my work. I want to reduce unintended consequences.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, I think it's kind of a nice segue into my next question is kind of applying some of this to like the fraud prevention and detection, business model. So, proactive fraud prevention is always considered to be the most effective way to improve, right? Get out in front of it, make sure you're ready for anything, but one of the challenges that I think a lot of fraud examiners understand is, tailoring anti-fraud programs to meet like the unique needs of your situation is what makes, the role of an anti-fraud professional so important, because like to your point there, Heather, there are certain outcomes that we can plan for and certain things that we can't plan for. And so being able to not only understand, if you have budget restrictions or resource allocation problems, where do you put the time and the effort to make sure that, your organization is protected from fraud? And obviously threat landscape is always changing. So being able to think ahead like that is so important. So I'm wondering, as is, you started to kind of think a little bit about our conversation. How might fraud examiners use some of these ideas of strategic foresight to anticipate the needs of their organization? And whether it be at the very beginning, kind of doing a fraud risk assessment, understanding where are there gaps, where are there internal control things that we need to focus on. So if you're coming in and looking at an organization, what are some of those first steps to determining where do we need to start, and where can we go from here?
Well, one of the things I like to do when I am doing any type of new research is I have a set of interview questions that I ask folks.
Okay.
And what I bring is the process. Like, you guys already have the answers. You just need to ask the right kinds of questions and think about those answers in a slightly different way. For example, you guys, so one of the things that you said that I want to just touch base on is, yes, I do believe that there are things with strategic foresight you can anticipate about the future. And when those things start to emerge, you can be like, oh, it's like that thing. Oh, we can respond faster. And if you're okay with a nerdy analogy, I like to explain that as you're able to see the Klingon ship decloak before everyone else.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
you can react better, right? So there's those. And then there's also things that will just be wild cards that like we won't be able to anticipate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the way I look at that is like useful to do this type of plan because you know the stuff that might be coming and you can be prepared for that. And then you have more capacity and resiliency to respond to things that, surprise us. So let's talk about the stuff that that Klingon ship that we can see decloak before everyone else. This stuff you guys are already looking at in strategic foresight. We kind of have a couple terms for this. We might call it weak signals, or looking at trends. Maybe a wild card, something that is low probability, high impact event. Also, I think criminals are just naturally some of the most creative, innovative people. And understanding what technology enables. Okay, so what does technology enable? Like, you might be looking at, I'm sure we're going to talk about AI, right? So whatever the big new tech trend is, you could be like, oh, how can this potentially impact in a positive way and a negative way to the kinds of fraud we're already seeing, right? So it's applying a tech trend to existing types of fraud activities. Also, I'm sure you guys are like your fraud examiners are like, oh my God, this guy was so so creative. He came up with this idea. This would be like something that maybe would be really unique, some kind of new type of scam or type of fraud. And it might be a leading indicator or a weak signal, something that maybe not everyone's doing yet, but might be like something that might be coming further down. So not ignoring some of these like outliers. We have a phrase that futurists like to use is like, the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. So you could say like the future of fraud's already here. It's just already unevenly distributed. There's like little pockets of fraud that are already emerging. And then you can also look at like, kind of what I would consider the more standard trends, which would be, how many people are getting phone scams, or how many people are, what's going on with business email compromise? Is it still being targeted? Are they using like deep fakes or something like that more? Are there new cybersecurity companies or security companies that have a new type of product release trying to address that? That sounds like a lot, but really all anyone needs to do is like, what are the cool, crazy stories that are like, oh my God, the outliers? And then what are kind of the stuff that's kind of, like growing over time? And then if you really want to be crazy and you like technology, you can be like, oh, what's this new technology? Like quantum. How could quantum impact fraud? That could be like a fun type of thought experiment that you could kind of look at, and you'd be way ahead of the ball there on that one. Does that stuff all make sense?
Oh yeah, I think it's such a I would almost say a commonly held belief, but there are so many fraud scams out there that are the same as they were, you know, 50, 60 years ago. Check fraud, it's the same fraud as it is then. It's just a little bit different systems in play, different ways that, I think we'll talk a little bit about identity theft and, with the advent of deep fake technology and cloning and how it's still identity theft, by the book. It just looks and feels a lot different with that advent of technology, to your point.
Yeah. Yeah. Technology has really enabled a lot more deep fake, which so some areas of technology that we never would kind of see as like a fraud vector
Yeah.
have become really big. Also, another thing is like, say some part, like, I don't know, let's say for example, we had like there was some technology that solved phone scams, right? No longer would people be able to make scam phone calls. They would all be gone, right? Well, those scammers aren't going away. They're going to go move to some other type of scam. So as like a particular threat vector gets resolved or solved by technology, it might push the bad guys to try to do something that was maybe a little more onerous or took more cost or something like that. So that's how kind of like, you can have more of a systems view of where fraud is moving in the world. I'm sure you probably already
Yeah.
have folks that are like really nerding out on stuff like that.
Yeah, it kind of goes to the next point I wanted to get to a little bit. You talk about the outliers and things that they may really be way out there in terms of a perceived threat, but in a short amount of time, we'll talk about artificial intelligence right now. AI has become the thing that is worrying not just fraud examiners, but I think businesses in general of how's it going to change what we do? How is it going to change the threats that we face? So I have a few stats. So the ACFE, so in partnership with SAS, we release every 2 years our anti-fraud technology benchmarking report. And so the last one we done in 2024, and we'll have a new one coming up in 2026. So the people we surveyed in that particular report told us that machine learning and use of AI was going to triple in the next 2 years within their anti-fraud programs. And 83% of organizations were expected to implement some form of generative AI into their anti-fraud programs in 2 years. So again, that was 2 years ago. And as it is now, I can't open my email today without, seeing something about a new tool, some way to improve the work that I do. I'm sure you see a lot of the same. So, one of the takeaways for me, which I know that we've talked about before, Heather, is this idea that, new technologies seem to make us more efficient, they make us faster, and they open up at the same time that Pandora's box of potential security and fraud risk that, companies have to decide, how quickly do we want to implement and get ahead of the curve, and how do we need to slow down and understand, what are the risks for our business? How is this going to change our business, not just for the good, but also for the bad? So, kind of through that cybersecurity lens, how have you seen businesses kind of address this like uptick in wanting AI technology and then all the new tools and things that are coming out there? And this is a bit of a loaded question. So, are
That's
we on the
okay.
right path in your mind? And then, what kind of conversations do you think from a cybersecurity perspective, should be taking place when it comes to incorporating AI at all different stages of an anti-fraud program or just in general, like business practices?
Yeah. Okay. So John, that's a lot there. Let me collect my thoughts. I had so many responses while you were talking. Um, okay. So first off, AI is pretty cool. But it's at the very beginning of our usage of it, at least whatever, a couple years out. Um, I was just doing a keynote a couple of weeks ago, last month, and one of the points I was making is, it was about agentic AI, which is AI agents that can do work on your behalf or in a company or something. And it's at the peak of the hype cycle, of the Gartner hype cycle, and everyone looks at this as like, oh, this bad thing. But this is actually something I've seen over and over when you have new technologies as a futurist. You have new technologies, you see the possible future vision that it can be. But unfortunately, what we imagine it can do is probably like a few years out than what it can really do now. So there's like
Mm-hmm.
this gap, right? This like we try to use it and it doesn't do what we want it to do. So we get mad at it. And then we're like, oh, it failed. Okay. But really, it's like this technology is developed, all technology is developed in an iterative fashion, and not just like iterative in like the releases, but how we use it. So the people who building AI and all these chatbots and all these agents and stuff, they release it. People use it. We learn more. We want to do more things with it. Then they add more features to it. Rev 2.0 comes out. We iterate. We also learn things about ourselves, and we learn things about what it takes to execute with it. I've been doing some interviews with this book. I'm writing a book, the Cybersecurity Futures Playbook, and I'm interviewing like CISOs and SOC analysts and folks who work in security, and everyone there is wanting to use AI and thinking about using AI and replace like their human analysts and things like that. But what they're realizing is that you need to have like a baseline process. You need to have the knowledge and the playbook in order to program your agent or your AI or your LLM or your customized whatever system you're bringing into your organization, so that it has your organization's knowledge, understanding, how to use it, that type of thing. Okay, let's be real. Not that many people do that. Maybe fraud examiners, fraud folks do, because probably I like process and documentation. Your folks probably like documentation too, right? So you probably have a lot of that already. So that's great. The other thing that I think is really important is this whole idea of like replacing technology, replacing humans with technology. It's just so misguided, because it's not about one is better than the other. Like, yeah, of course, technology is way better for some things than humans are. But there are things that humans are better at than technology, whether it's like AI or not. For example, like talking to a SOC analyst I was interviewing, I was like, yes, there are some things, a programmed AI, they can find pattern recognition, they can find patterns, they can say, oh, what about this or what about that? There's a whole bunch of like automation that could be run with technology. That would just be so onerous for a human to do. But an AI agent is not going to look at something and say, I feel weird about this. Right? I'm sure your fraud folks also have this, I don't know, kind of spidey sense or something. Like it might look perfect, but there's just something in the back of your mind that's like, I don't know, something about this just feels too perfect or not perfect or something like that. Yeah. So this idea of like, let the human be the thing that they're really good at, and let the technology do the thing that they're really good at. And let's see that as augmentation. And even as we're talking about AI now, like I've been talking about this stuff for over 10, 15 years, but I never really called it AI. I called it augmentation. Even my phone is an augmentation of my humanness. It allows me to connect and get information and work faster. And that's what these AI agents and LLMs will be able to do with us ourselves, and also our roles in organizations, and even our organizations, and even the criminals, you know? And when I talk about like this whole idea of like, let the human be the best human, let the tech be the best tech, and let's augment together, that just seems really obvious to me. It takes the best of both things, but we get so enamored with technology, and we think new technology is oversold. Mm-hmm. But we need to be pragmatic and say, okay, yes, it will be able to do all that stuff, or it can do kind of some of that stuff, but maybe not all of it. And that's not a reason not to use this new kind of anti-fragile technology, because as you're using it, you learn how to use it. It changes you. It changes how you think about using it. I can't tell you, like, your audience can try using these things, and I'm certain that they will be like, oh, wow, I could use it for this or for that. I mean, we just naturally get a new tool and we think, oh, I could use it for that. Wasn't the initial reason why that technology was built. And so that's one of the reasons why we should explore with the new technology. And also, it's an opportunity for us to influence the future and influence the trajectory of this future. Like if you start adopting and using some of these AI agents or AI, then you can say whoever, you're getting it, you're using it from, you can talk about it out in the industry. You could be a thought leader. You can say, we found it worked for this type of stuff, but this stuff, we felt like it fell short. And like give feedback back to the organizations building these solutions so that it can be better. So it's kind of like a relationship. In order, by using the product, you're able to influence the future of that product.
That's a great point, because one of the things that I think everybody who's an investigator, fraud investigator, otherwise understands is there is a level of efficiency that AI can bring, but it has to pair naturally with some of those, interpersonal skill sets, behavioral psychology, social awareness, interviewing skills. That's not something that an AI tool is going to be able to replace. You have to be able to develop that. And then to your point, augmentation, it's not replacing. And I think, fraud professionals will know well that, there is a certain level of, I would just say, human awareness that comes with this type of work that you have to have. So yes, while, from a leadership perspective, there might be, a great way to save money, to save time, but I don't think the foundational role of a fraud examiner is going to like necessarily be thrown out the window, because you have to be able to have some of that human implication and be able to look at what maybe the AI is giving you, or to your point, have an agent who has all the Rolodex of everything that maybe is organizational controls or framework policy, built in to be able to pull that kind of stuff faster. But that human element is still critical. And I don't see a world where that is necessarily going to be replaced, because you have to still have some of those skills.
I mean, also, humans are in this world, right? Like, we're going to be
Yeah.
interacting with other humans. We don't want to only interact with technology or like digital agents. Like, our
Yeah.
lives are with our families and our friends and other human beings, and we want to enable those connections. And even like the work, people are doing, it's work for humans. The technology and these tools are just tools that hopefully, this is what I try to believe, hopefully help us live better, safer, secure, self-actualized lives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And another area of kind of overlap that I wanted to kind of get your opinion on, again, being from a cyber background and understanding the, I think very technical nature of it. I think that applies very much with what an anti-fraud professional is going to do with communicating that to other people within your business or client, if you were or client work or whatever. Communicating needs and challenge, right? And being able to take some of this really complicated subject matter, distill it down, and present it in a way that someone who maybe isn't as technologically proficient or is so understanding in some of the minutia is able to understand. So, I'm wondering, in like how you're presenting some of these ideas, whether it be to clients or to businesses, how do you find taking some of that like kind of high level, maybe technical jargon, if you will, and other like hurdles like that, and just like simplifying them and making sure that, leadership can take some of these insights and actually bake them into, anti-fraud and risk strategies or cyber strategies, and being able to do it in a way that they're confident in. Because certainly from a fraud investigator's perspective, like I said earlier, budget, resource allocation is a big thing, and being able to understand that, yes, we have a business, but it needs protected, and here's why. So yeah, I'm curious, like how you found being able to communicate some of those complex ideas and make them digestible for everyone.
So there's like two strategies. One of the directors of DARPA in, I think, the 60s or the 70s, George Heilmeyer, he had this thing he called the Heilmeyer Catechism. And it was basically like a set of 6 questions that whoever wanted to do a DARPA project had to answer them. And the first question was, explain what you're doing or what you hope to do using absolutely no jargon. And I did some government work a few years ago, and they were told me to follow this guidance. And ever since I found the Heilmeyer Catechism, I really try to understand that. I really try to understand how I can communicate the core of what my message, what I'm trying to communicate in very clear, concise language. It's not easy. And I don't always feel like I'm very good at it. Even your question asking, what does a futurist do? I want to step into the jargon of my strategic foresight. Um, so being really conscious of the jargon and trying to write it and be very clear. When you, like, I write reports and stuff like that. In reports, I try to use images and infographics, and also my second point is stories. We understand stories. Future scenarios are mini stories. I've written many like general stories. I've written many user-based scenario stories where I call them character-based scenarios. So you take like a character and they're in the future. Like, for example, I could take like a future fraud examiner, say 5, 10, 50 years out. What's the day in the life as a future fraud examiner in 2050? That is something that probably anyone who's listening to this, maybe when you shut it off, take a moment and just write, what would I do? What would my job be like in 2050? How do I think it would change? You could write a little story like that. And then let's talk about those trends. Let's bring those trends back, right? So those little trends that we were talking about, you pepper those in, you bring those in. How could you could write a future scenario based on a criminal? Like this type of fraud is happening right now. And so how would a similar type of fraud happen, say, in 10 years when the technology is different? You yourself said the same fraud keeps happening enabled with different technologies. We didn't say exactly that, but that's how I took it. So using stories, being really clear about your language, which does require a little bit of self-awareness about the jargon of your industry, and generally just trying to communicate and understand and be curious. Understand when someone might not understand something a certain way. Can you reframe it in a different way so that it makes sense to them?
I really like that exercise of thinking about yourself 20, 25 years from now and writing it down and trying to kind of see it in practice. I really like that. Yeah, that's I think a commonly held theme with a lot of people who are in a very technical role is understanding how to communicate that and kind of understanding, what does it look like, and being able to kind of show it in layman's terms, if you will, and be able to really present it in that kind of storytelling way. I think is really interesting exercise to try.
Yeah, I would. Okay, so if anyone's listening to this and you do that kind of like future you day in the life, please email me. I'd love to hear about it. That's one of the questions I ask folks when I interview them. One of the other questions that's kind of interesting that has a lot of really great results is if you had a magic wand and you could wave it and change or fix anything, what would it be? And that really gets to the heart of like, what's the real main pain point in your work or your life or your industry right now? And when I interview a bunch of people about this and then do an analysis of it, then you like that, the answers to that question really inform like what could be happening, and also like I don't want to just like focus on the problems either. One of the tools that I learned really early on called appreciative inquiry. I thought it was like a little bit too ungrounded, a little woo-woo. But I've used it with much success. It rather than looking at a problem and how to solve it, it looks at a situation and is like, what's working well right now? So I think this could also possibly be applied to your audience where it's like, okay, so in fraud, what are you guys doing today that is working well? And then how can you make sure that you're able to keep doing that and in the future, right? So between looking at some trends, what would your magic wand fix? What's going well? Take that and then extrapolate yourself out. Just you, 10 or 20 or however many years in the future, and have a little, pretend you're a sci-fi writer, just write out some bullet points and see what you think.
Yeah, I like that because it's, you don't want to throw everything out. We're not totally changing what we do, but how can we, going back to your point, or augment what we do? How can we make those slight tweaks to what we're doing? I think it's a
Yeah.
really smart way to think about it. So Heather, so I I can't end a podcast without asking you a little bit about some fraud schemes. So you've explored actually this idea of self-sovereign or decentralized identity and kind of its potential applications and how, whether it's already presented now or what could be happening in the future. Identity theft is obviously, I think, a pretty well understood, at least, in popular culture, understanding, the impacts of it and protecting your personal identity is such a huge thing, across so many different systems, whether it be bank information, personal social accounts. There's so many ways that, identity can be exploited. So I'm just kind of wondering, and kind of what you've seen with this idea of this like decentralized identity, what should fraud examiners like know about this technology? And then kind of as it evolves, how could it kind of, inject itself into society, whether it be at a personal level or maybe in like a business use case and kind of that professional sense? Because I'm sure that as with all technology, inevitably, there are going to be fraudsters who are going to find a way to access it. Even if it is decentralized in a way and maybe secure, there's still a way in, I'm sure eventually. So I'm just curious, about this technology a little bit and kind of what you've seen in your exploration of it and how it could potentially evolve.
Yeah, well, decentralized identity was really like designed to solve the problem of huge aggregate databases that aggregate my data and your data. Whereas if the bad guy gets in, they have access to not just my data, they have access to your data and hundreds of thousands of other people's data because it's in a big database. Decentralized identity like totally flips that paradigm, whereas there's no big centralized database where all you have to do is crack into it and then you get everything. It's like my data is secured and I specify who I can share it with based on cryptography and keys and key pairs and things like that. So if someone wanted to crack into my identity, they would have to spend as much effort to get into mine as into yours. So it's really good for protecting personal data and enable secure sharing. Like if I wanted to securely share something with a bank or with my doctor, something that I don't want out there. However, the uptake on this by businesses has not been great. And that's because this goes directly against the business model of selling data. So if you have a huge database with all of our data together, right? Okay, it's aggregated, centralized, and the companies are selling our data, right? So not only does decentralized identity secure our data, it allows us to have ownership and control over our data again. But organizations that make a lot of money selling our personal data are not going to adopt this. We thought for a while that like selling the security benefits would be a good way to get people to adopt it. But I mean, the big companies, it's just been slow going, to be honest. There's some other organizations or some other industries that are kind of looking at decentralized identity as a way to share data. It's decentralized identity and verifiable credentials. So it's like, one of the ways where it's been really taken up is with mobile driver's licenses. So you have like your mobile driver's license that is issued by your government or by your state, which is a government agency, onto your mobile device, and you can trust that. And even at some airports, I think even like last time I flew through Austin, you can use that, your mobile driver's license, in order to be able to go through your security or the TSA there. So the dream of decentralized identity and verifiable credentials is still there. And it's been around for, 5-8 years. But the adoption has been slow because of these other business reasons. And that also shows like these trajectories into the future. We may have a technology that would really solve a big problem, but it's not getting adopted for all these other types of reasons. And that's when something like regulation or something like that would come in order to force governments or force companies to comply, like that regulation that companies had to notify the SEC if they have a breach over a certain amount of time. They're not going to like willingly do that. So there's really a lot of puzzle pieces that put pressure on different things to make it work. And yeah, I think there's still a huge opportunity for decentralized identity and verifiable credentials, but it's not really being adopted broadly, except in the case of these mobile driver's licenses, which is kind of a big deal in some ways.
Yeah, again, it's such a new technology. To your point, I mean, 5 to 8 years is really not that much time, but the adoption, I think it just goes back to understanding what are the potential applications for the future and kind of taking that time to see, okay, what are the pros, what are the cons, and then kind of understanding, on a personal level too, like, is this right for me? Is this something that I need to invest
Yeah.
time and energy and focus in? Again, there's lots of other, I think, examples of it. Like you said, there's good and there's bad, but I think just going back to the point of, there is a lot of unknown with the technology that requires a lot of, I think, patience and modeling. Going back to what you said at the beginning, is understanding potential outcomes and roads down the way that could this technology potentially be used for.
Yeah, I think like a lot of evangelists and companies um, do a disservice to these new technologies by pitching these visions that are going to be real in like 5, 10, 15 years. And then people are like, use it. We get sold these visions and then they fall short. And then whatever, we move on to the next one. I, I don't know. It's not exciting or sexy or like, the hot new thing. It's a little bit more boring, but like, I mean, the future happens with steps at a time, with pragmatic implementation of technology. And I know that there's those folks behind all of that, but I guess I'd like to see like a little bit more of like a balanced view of some of these things out there, not like have the media so like ADD, like distracting us, and let us kind of be grounded. And also like, I had this epiphany like a couple of months ago, is like, that's when we can actually influence the future. We can influence the trajectory of these technologies. And depending on what your company or what an organization, what resources you have to put behind the future you want to have happen, you can even more strongly influence the trajectory of these futures. Like, say like the fraud organization is like done with these centralized databases that are keeping getting hacked, and because like the companies aren't making the shift on their own, maybe you put like an incentive structure in place that incentivizes people from using a technology that reduces the database attack variable. I know I went through a whole lot of steps there. I hope that made sense. But like, that is like your organization, your industry has influence. You can influence the trajectory and the use of some of these technologies by saying, hey, why aren't you using this better thing, like seatbelts or something? Like, you could save lives. Or there's many different examples of the past.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you have to kind
Go
of
ahead.
think
Go
a
ahead.
little bit you have to kind of think a little bit a different way. And when we're really focused on our jobs and our work, I mean, oftentimes we don't have the extra bandwidth to even kind of think this type of way, to realize that we can do things that could influence the future in certain ways.
Yeah. I think just taking that little bit of time to kind of understand that, I think that kind of encapsulates being a futurist in of itself. Is like taking the time to think about it and kind of understand it. So, this has been real. I feel like we could keep talking for at length about all this kind of stuff. But I really appreciate your insight, and like you said, there's so many different things that what goes into being a futurist, strategic foresight. But I think that was kind of a great overview of what it is and how to kind of take that with into consideration. And no matter what your role is, whether it be at a lower level or at a leadership role, and kind of figuring out how best does this work for me. So I just want to, kind of close by saying, if anyone's listening today wants to learn a little bit more about strategic foresight or even cybersecurity, which you have a background in, where can they find some more information or some research? I know you mentioned you're working on another book, but how can they kind of find some more information on that?
Yeah, well, you can find me on LinkedIn as Heather Vescent. So follow or connect me if you've heard me on this podcast and you want to connect, just drop me a little note. I also have a Substack, cybersecurityfutures.substack.com, and that's kind of where I talk about I kind of try to keep it cybersecurity focused, but also I like spies and espionage, and I'm doing some other writing in that realm. So I kind of we'll talk about the screenplay or some other stuff I'm writing. And then, I've got some books. I've written some books on Amazon, Cyber Attack Survival Manual, The Secrets of Spies. And it's about 8 years old now, but the Comprehensive Guide to Self-Sovereign Identity. And if you've got questions, just connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message. And if you did that scenario and you want to give me some feedback on it, please get in touch. Please contact me.
Well, thanks so much, Heather. I hope we get to do this again. It's actually, I have a bunch more questions I don't have time to get to, but thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, it was so much fun. Thank you, John, so much. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, of course. And thanks everyone for listening. You can find every episode of Fraud Talk on ACFE.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you listen. I'm John Duffley, signing off.